Tonight, more than 300,000 people across southern Europe do not have a home to return to. Not because of war, not because of an earthquake, because of fire. In the space of a single week, Spain, France, and Italy have gone from managing a difficult summer to running some of the largest civilian evacuations any of these countries have seen in peacetime. Militaries have been deployed. Borders have opened for firefighting crews from half a dozen nations. And officials who almost never say this kind of thing out loud have stood in front of cameras and admitted plainly that the fires are currently beyond their ability to stop. This is where things stand right now, and it is worth slowing down and understanding not just what is burning, but why this particular fire season looks so different from the ones that came before it. Start with Spain, because what has happened around Madrid this week should not, on paper, be possible for a modern European capital. The Spanish government declared a national emergency, which is not a routine designation. It is reserved for situations where regional authorities have lost the ability to manage a crisis on their own, and the central government has to take direct control. The worst of the fire is burning west of the capital, in the hills between Madrid and the province of Ávila, near a town called San Martín de Valdeiglesias. Two separate wildfires have grown so large that along a roughly 14 to 15 kilometer stretch, they are touching each other, and the commanders on the ground have been fighting simply to keep them from merging into a single, much larger front. Spain handed control of the firefighting effort to its military emergency unit, a force that exists specifically for disasters civilian agencies cannot handle alone. That decision tells you almost everything you need to know about how serious officials believe this is. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of vehicles, and more than 20 aircraft have been thrown at the fire. And they have been joined by crews flown in from Greece, Italy, and Portugal because Spain's own resources were not enough on their own. The Madrid region's emergency chief, Carlos Novillo, described the fire near the capital as being at its peak and said it was currently beyond the capacity of firefighters to contain. That is an extraordinary sentence for a public official to say into a microphone, and it was not an accident. Officials do not say something like that unless they need the public to understand the actual scale of what is happening, not a softened version of it. The numbers out of Spain keep moving because the fires keep moving. Roughly 10,000 hectares have burned in the Madrid region itself, with another 13 to 15,000 hectares gone in neighboring Ávila. Tens of thousands of residents have been evacuated across the country, with additional thousands more confined to their homes as a precaution, while fire crews try to hold the lines. Spain is not only fighting fire around its capital. Blazes have also broken out in the Valencia region, where a man was killed in a fire near the suburb of Manises, becoming the first confirmed fatality of this round of fires in Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has been visiting the affected areas directly, meeting with residents in villages inside the fire zone, and telling reporters that the government's priority is saving lives and protecting inhabited areas. He has also warned more than once that difficult hours lie ahead because even when temperatures dip slightly, the wind does not become predictable. And wind, more than heat alone, is what turns a manageable fire into an unmanageable one. It is worth pausing on why the location of these fires matters so much. Spain has dealt with wildfire for generations, but historically the worst of it has concentrated in the drier south and along the Mediterranean coast. What is different this year is that serious, fast-moving fire is burning in the mountainous terrain that rings Madrid itself, land that planners and residents alike had generally assumed was somewhat buffered by elevation and by its distance from the hottest, driest parts of the country. When fire of this scale burns close enough to a capital city that its smoke chokes the streets, that is not a local anomaly. That is a sign that the geography of fire risk in Spain is shifting, and shifting toward places that were not built, staffed, or planned around this level of danger. Now move to France, because what is unfolding in the southwest is, in some ways, even harder to process. Along the Atlantic coast, in the Gironde department around Bordeaux, wildfires have forced the evacuation of well over 150,000 people, with tens of thousands more ordered out of neighboring lands. Combined with the numbers coming out of Spain, authorities have described the overall displacement across the two countries as surpassing 300,000 people. And French officials have called their own evacuation effort one of the largest peacetime evacuations the country has ever carried out. That phrase, peacetime, is doing a lot of work. It is being used deliberately to draw a contrast with the only other kind of event that typically forces this many French citizens from their homes on this kind of timeline: war. When officials feel the need to specify that a mass evacuation is happening during peacetime, it is because the scale of it would otherwise be assumed to require a conflict to explain. The fires tearing through Gironde are burning in and around the Landes forest, the largest forested area in Western Europe. It is worth knowing that this forest is not really a wild, ancient landscape. It was planted deliberately in the 19th century to stabilize sand dunes along the coast, and it is dominated by maritime pine, a tree that happens to be almost perfectly suited to burning. Maritime pines are full of resin and oil, They shed a thick layer of needle litter that piles up as ready fuel on the forest floor. And they tend to grow in dense, uniform stands that let fire leap from treetop to treetop, far faster than it could move through a mixed, more open woodland. In other words, a huge portion of what is currently on fire in southwestern France is, structurally, some of the most flammable forest terrain in Europe. And it has spent the summer drying out under exactly the conditions that make it worst. One of the places hit hardest is Les Cap Ferret, a well-known resort area on the coast that fills up every summer with tourists and seasonal residents. Emergency alerts were pushed directly to phones, ordering people in several towns to move immediately toward Bordeaux, and the shelters there filled quickly. There is something particularly disorienting about evacuating a resort town in the middle of the summer season, because a large share of the people being moved are not locals who know the back roads and the muster points. They are visitors, on holiday, suddenly navigating an unfamiliar emergency in an unfamiliar place. A separate fire further down the coast, around Biscarrosse and Parentis-en-Born, burned thousands of hectares on its own and triggered tens of thousands of additional evacuations, some of them carried out by boat because roads were not a viable option. At least one death has been confirmed in the French fires as well. France appealed for international assistance, and the response has been significant. Crews and equipment have arrived from multiple European countries, and the French government has deployed everything from water-bombing aircraft to military cargo planes dropping retardant over the blazes near Bordeaux. President Emmanuel Macron, after chairing a crisis meeting, pledged that the government would rebuild and remain present in the affected communities for as long as necessary. There's a part of this story that tends to get compressed into a single sentence in most coverage, and it deserves more room because it connects the immediate emergency to a much longer economic tale. Bordeaux is not just a French region. It is one of the most valuable wine-producing landscapes on the planet, a place where soil composition, drainage, and microclimate, down to the level of individual plots, have been cultivated for centuries to produce something that cannot simply be recreated somewhere else. You cannot relocate a Bordeaux vineyard the way you might relocate a factory. The vines are rooted in specific ground, some of them decades or generations old. Wine experts have been careful to say that the vineyards themselves have not been directly destroyed, and that the grapes are not yet developed enough to have absorbed smoke taint, the phenomenon where grapes take on smoke compounds from wildfire and pass a permanently altered, often unpleasant character into the finished wine. But that reassurance rests entirely on the word yet. The fires are still active. Smoke is still hanging over the region. The grapes are still on the vine, still developing, still exposed. Every additional day the fires burn adds uncertainty to what the 2026 vintage will actually taste like, and by extension, to an industry worth enormous sums of money and centuries of accumulated reputation. Then there is Italy, where the situation looks different on the surface, but comes from the same underlying source. Sicily has been under sustained pressure for weeks, with well over 1,000 separate firefighting interventions recorded on the island since the middle of the month. That is not the size of a single fire. That is the cumulative weight of an island responding to fire after fire after fire, week after week, without much time to recover in between. A firefighter died, battling a blaze near Catania. Large active fires have burned thousands of hectares near Favara and Resutano, and homes across the island have had to be evacuated. On Italy's southeastern coast in Puglia near Peschici, a wind-driven fire broke out and forced the evacuation of hundreds of tourists and swimmers from beaches and campgrounds, with the Italian Coast Guard rescuing people who had nowhere to go except into the water, pulling them onto boats while smoke rolled across the coastline. Sardinia has faced its own separate emergencies, including fires that forced beach closures and shut down coastal roads. What makes Italy's case worth studying closely is not just this year's fires on their own, but what they are burning through. Sicily has had serious fire seasons in each of the last several summers, and land that burned 2 or 3 years ago has not fully recovered. Fire behaves differently when it moves through terrain that is still in an early stage of recovery from a previous burn. The soil is more exposed. The root systems that would normally anchor hillside soil are weaker, which raises the risk of serious erosion once the autumn and winter rains eventually arrive. Sicily's agricultural economy, which depends heavily on almond orchards, citrus groves, and olive cultivation, is absorbing compounding damage from consecutive fire seasons that never get a real chance to reset. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, a slower-moving but equally serious crisis is playing out along the Po River, Italy's longest waterway and the primary water source for millions of people and tens of thousands of farms across the Po Valley. Persistent heat and drought have pushed the river to record low levels. In response, municipalities in the Piedmont region have introduced real financial penalties for anyone caught using drinking water to wash a car or water a garden. That is worth sitting with for a moment. One of the wealthiest, most industrially developed regions in Europe is now rationing tap water because there genuinely is not enough of it to go around. This is not happening in some far-off, resource-poor corner of the world. It is happening in the industrial heartland of northern Italy in 2026. So why is all of this happening at once, across 3 different countries, in landscapes that range from coastal pine forest to Mediterranean scrubland to the river valleys of the north? The honest answer is that these are not 3 unrelated disasters that happen to line up on a calendar. They are 3 regional expressions of the same underlying condition: a prolonged, record-breaking heat wave sitting over southern and western Europe, layered on top of a drought pattern that has been intensifying for years, producing vegetation so dry that a single spark, or even just friction from machinery or a discarded cigarette, is enough to start a fire that spreads far faster than it would have a generation ago. It helps to understand why dryness matters so much, because the relationship is not simple and linear, it is closer to exponential. Slightly dry vegetation is somewhat easier to ignite than wet vegetation, but severely dry vegetation behaves almost like a fuse. Once soil and plant material have been stripped of moisture to the degree they have across large parts of southern Europe this summer, fire does not just become a little more likely. It becomes dramatically more likely, and once ignited, it spreads at a pace that overwhelms containment strategies built around a slower-moving threat. The forests currently burning in the Spanish mountains and the pine stands of southwestern France did not become this vulnerable overnight. They have been drying out week after week, for months, effectively building toward this moment without anyone being able to see the exact day it would arrive. Wind is the other half of the equation, and it is arguably the more frustrating half because it is the part that resists prediction and planning. Firefighting crews can cut fire breaks, position aircraft, and pre-stage water and retardant drops based on where a fire is expected to move. Those tactics work reasonably well under stable conditions. But when wind shifts direction suddenly, which has been happening repeatedly this week in both Spain and France, a fire break that was protecting one flank of a community can end up on the wrong side of the fire entirely. New fronts open where none were expected. Resources that were correctly positioned an hour earlier suddenly have to be moved, and in the time it takes to reposition trucks, aircraft, and personnel, the fire simply keeps burning. This is not a freak occurrence. Erratic, shifting wind is a standard feature of summer fire weather in southern Europe, but it becomes genuinely dangerous once you combine it with fuel that is this dry and terrain that is this mountainous, because mountainous terrain itself accelerates fire behavior, funneling wind and heat uphill in ways that flat land does not. There is a broader statistic that puts all of this into context, and it comes from health and environmental monitoring bodies tracking wildfire trends across the continent. Burned area across Europe has increased by roughly 57% over just the past 4 years. That is not a small drift. That is a sharp upward curve, and it means the emergency response systems currently in place, impressive as they are this week, were largely built for a fire season that no longer exists. The mutual aid network currently keeping Spain and France afloat, with crews and aircraft moving between Greece, Italy, Portugal, Germany, Romania, Croatia, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic, represents close to the practical ceiling of what cooperative European firefighting can currently deliver. And that ceiling is being tested hard, this week, by a single fire season. If burned area keeps climbing at anything close to the rate it has over the last 4 years, the current model of mutual aid, however well it has performed, is not obviously built to scale much further. It is also worth being honest about what this means for people who live in these regions, because the risk does not simply end once these particular fires are finally brought under control, however many more days or weeks that takes. The drought conditions driving this crisis will not fully reverse before next summer arrives. Europe is not experiencing an unusually bad year layered on top of an otherwise stable climate. It is moving into a pattern where fire seasons start earlier, run longer, and reach into places that were not historically considered high risk. Coastal wine country outside Bordeaux and mountain terrain within view of Madrid's skyline are not remote wilderness. They are inhabited, economically vital, densely used landscapes, and the fact that fire of this intensity is reaching them changes the calculation for how these countries need to plan, build, and ensure against future summers, not just how they respond to this one. None of this is meant to diminish what has actually been accomplished this week, because the scale of the emergency response has been genuinely extraordinary. Spain handing command to its military emergency unit, France carrying out what officials themselves are calling one of the largest peacetime evacuations in the country's history, Italy managing simultaneous fire crises across multiple regions while also confronting a slow-motion water shortage in the north. 8 or more countries moving personnel and aircraft across borders within days, because no single nation has the resources to face this scale of fire alone. All of that is real, and it represents a genuine, coordinated commitment of people and equipment to an enormous, fast-moving problem. But it is also true that nearly every official statement coming out of Madrid, Bordeaux, and Rome this week includes some version of the same caveat. Full control will not be possible until the weather itself changes, and forecasters are not currently predicting that change to arrive soon. The people affected by all of this did not do anything to invite it. They did not build recklessly or ignore warnings that existed a decade ago. Many of them live in communities that have stood for generations, in landscapes that are now being reshaped by conditions largely outside any individual family's control. Towns that have never previously burned are burning this year. Forests that would normally take decades to regenerate are being lost within days, and the fire season, by every official account, is not close to finished. Authorities across the region have warned that extreme wildfire danger could persist through the rest of the summer. If there is a practical piece of guidance worth repeating here, it is simple, and it comes directly from the people running these evacuations. Follow instructions from local civil protection authorities immediately, without waiting to see how a situation develops further. In several cases this week, fires have moved faster than the evacuation orders themselves, which means the margin for waiting and watching has been thinner than usual. The residents who left as soon as they were told to were the ones with enough time to gather what mattered and get out safely. The people who waited to assess the situation for themselves were, in a number of documented cases, the ones who ended up needing to be rescued. That is not a criticism of anyone's judgment in the moment. It is simply a reflection of how much faster these particular fires have been moving compared to what evacuation planning has historically assumed. For anyone watching from outside the affected regions who wants to do something concrete, the most useful step is supporting established, verified emergency response and relief organizations working directly in Spain, France, and Italy, rather than waiting for news coverage to move on. The physical damage from a fire season like this one is measured in the immediate weeks and months, but the recovery for displaced families, for scorched agricultural land, for forests that take decades to regrow, for a wine region trying to determine what survived intact and what did not, stretches out for years. The need for support in these communities will almost certainly outlast the news cycle by a wide margin, long after the smoke clears and the story stops leading the broadcast. It is useful, too, to place this week against Europe's recent fire history, because the comparison sharpens exactly how unusual the current situation is. Southern France and Spain have burned before, including a notably bad stretch back in 2022, when fires around Gironde forced tens of thousands of evacuations, and Spain recorded hundreds of separate wildfire outbreaks that destroyed well over 250,000 hectares of land in a single year. At the time, that 2022 season was treated as a landmark event, the kind of summer climate scientists pointed to as an early preview of what a warmer Europe would look like. What is striking about this year is not that a bad fire season happened again. It is how quickly the baseline for what counts as a bad fire season has moved. The evacuation numbers now being reported out of Gironde alone, well over 150,000 people from that department in a matter of days, dwarf what was considered an exceptional headline-grabbing evacuation just a few years earlier. If 2022 was the warning, this week looks like the thing the warning was actually about. Understanding the military emergency unit's role in Spain also helps explain why this response looks so different from a typical summer fire season. The unit, commonly referred to by its Spanish acronym, is not a firefighting service in the conventional sense. It is a rapid deployment military force built specifically for catastrophic scenarios where ordinary civilian agencies, however competent, are structurally unable to coordinate a response of the necessary size and speed. It brings military-grade logistics and command infrastructure, the ability to move personnel and equipment across regional and jurisdictional lines without the delays that normally come with coordinating dozens of separate local authorities and direct access to military transport and aircraft that civilian fire services cannot simply requisition on short notice. Handing full command of a firefighting operation to that unit, rather than leaving it with the regional government, is Spain's way of signaling, through action rather than announcement, that this has moved past the category of a difficult but manageable summer fire. The Guadalajara fire, burning northeast of Madrid, deserves a bit more attention than it typically receives in short news summaries, because it is effectively a second simultaneous crisis, unfolding alongside the fires closer to the capital. That blaze alone has consumed roughly 32,000 hectares, an area comparable in size to a mid-sized city, and forced evacuations across dozens of villages. The forest in that province is heavily pined, and pine forest in that part of Spain typically takes somewhere between 40 and 60 years to return to anything resembling its pre-fire condition. That is not a detail that shows up in a single evacuation order, but it is the detail that will define what life looks like for residents of that province for the rest of their lives. People currently sheltering away from Guadalajara will eventually be allowed to return, and what they return to will be a fundamentally different landscape than the one they left, one that will not fully recover within their own lifetimes. The economic dimension of this crisis extends well beyond wine and agriculture, even though those sectors carry an outsized share of public attention because their losses are visible, storied, and easy to explain in a single sentence. Tourism across all three countries is being disrupted in the middle of peak summer season, which is precisely when southern Europe's coastal and rural economies earn the bulk of their annual revenue. Resort towns evacuated in Gironde, beaches cleared in Sardinia and Puglia, and campgrounds emptied along Italy's southeastern coast represent lost bookings, canceled trips, and disrupted seasonal income for small businesses that depend almost entirely on a compressed few months of summer visitors to survive the rest of the year. Insurance markets across the region are also watching closely, because repeated, escalating fire seasons change how insurers price risk in areas that were previously considered low or moderate risk. Property in the hills outside Madrid or along stretches of the French Atlantic coast is going to look different to underwriters after this summer than it did a year ago. And that repricing, when it comes, will land on homeowners and local governments long after this particular fire season has ended. There's also a slower, less visible cost building underneath all of this, and it has to do with soil and water rather than flame. Fire strips vegetation and root systems from hillsides, and root systems are what normally hold soil in place when heavy rain eventually arrives. Mediterranean regions do not stay dry indefinitely. Autumn and winter typically bring a return of rainfall, sometimes in sudden, intense bursts. When that rain falls on slopes that were burned bare only months earlier, the result is frequently serious erosion, and, in the more severe cases, flash flooding and mudslides that can be just as destructive to the same communities that already evacuated once this summer. Spain, France, and Italy have all experienced this sequence before. Fire in summer followed by flood-related damage in the following months. And forecasters and civil protection officials in each country are already factoring that possibility into their planning for later this year, even while the fires themselves are still active. There is also a policy conversation running quietly underneath all of the emergency response coverage, and it will likely grow louder once the immediate crisis passes. Forest management practices across southern Europe were largely designed for a climate that no longer exists in the same form. Plantations, like the one covering much of Gironde, were planted with economic goals in mind, timber production and dune stabilization, not fire resilience, and the dense, uniform stands of resinous pine that resulted are now recognized as a significant part of why fire moves through that landscape so aggressively once it starts. Similar questions are being raised in Spain and Italy about controlled burns, brush clearance, and rural depopulation, since fewer people living and working in the countryside has, over recent decades, meant less small-scale land management that once naturally reduced the buildup of flammable undergrowth. None of these are quick fixes, and none of them would have prevented this particular week's fires on their own, given how extreme the heat and drought conditions already were. But each of them shapes how much worse a fire, once started, is able to become, and each is likely to feature heavily in the policy reviews that typically follow a fire season of this severity. There is also a question of timing that is easy to overlook in the middle of an active emergency. How much of this could have been anticipated? Meteorological agencies across Europe had been flagging elevated fire risk for the region for weeks before these fires broke out, based on soil moisture readings, vegetation dryness indices, and long-range heat forecasts that all pointed in the same direction. That does not mean any individual fire's exact start time or location was predictable, since ignition is often accidental, human-caused, or the result of a lightning strike, and pinpointing that moment in advance is not realistically possible. But the underlying conditions that allowed a spark to turn into a fire of this scale were visible in the data well before the first flames were reported. That gap between conditions that were forecastable and outcomes that still overwhelmed emergency response capacity is likely to be one of the more uncomfortable questions civil protection agencies in all three countries have to answer once this season is over. Not whether they responded well once the fires started, which by most accounts they have, but whether enough was done in the weeks and months beforehand to reduce the odds of reaching this point at all. For now, though, the immediate priority in Madrid, Bordeaux, and Rome is not policy review. It is keeping people alive, keeping fire lines from merging into something even larger, and getting hundreds of thousands of displaced residents through the coming days safely with enough support that when they are finally allowed to go home, there is still something recognizable to return to. That work is happening around the clock, and it is happening because tens of thousands of firefighters, military personnel, and volunteers from at least 8 different countries have decided that this fire season, unlike so many before it, cannot be handled by any one nation alone. Right now, tonight, hundreds of thousands of people across 3 countries are sleeping somewhere other than home, in shelters, in gymnasiums, in exhibition halls converted into makeshift dormitories. Firefighting crews from across the continent are working through the night in conditions where the air itself carries real health risk. Military aircraft are dropping retardant over forests that 2 weeks ago were simply where people went on holiday. And officials who do not typically speak this bluntly have stood in front of cameras this week and said without hedging that what is burning is currently beyond their capacity to stop. That is where things stand as of today. The fire weather forecast has not meaningfully improved. The underlying drought is not going to resolve on its own timeline that matches anyone's convenience, and the story, by every indication coming out of Madrid, Bordeaux, and Rome, is far from finished. What happens over the next several days will likely determine whether this becomes remembered as a severe but ultimately contained summer emergency, or as the moment southern Europe's fire seasons crossed into a different category altogether, one that current infrastructure, however heroically deployed this week, was not originally built to absorb. Either way, the decision's being made right now by firefighters repositioning crews as wind shifts without warning, by officials weighing when to order the next evacuation, by residents deciding whether to trust the instruction to leave immediately, are the decisions that will shape how this particular chapter of the story ends. The broader question, of whether Europe is prepared for a future where summers like this one are not the exception, but closer to the rule, is one that will outlast the smoke, long after the fires now burning across Spain, France, and Italy are finally declared under control.